Fresh herbs have become one of my very favorite things to freeze dry. They're really easy to do if you know a few tricks, and they're incredibly delicious. They're very potent and retain a ton of fresh flavor, so they're really fun to cook with. Plus, they can be shelf stable for up to 20 years, and I'm going to show you from start to finish how I do it. Everything from how I pick and prepare them to the freeze drying process and how I package them up afterwards. So for herbs, freshness is everything. I always pick first thing in the morning. I get them processed immediately and into the freezer right away. I'm going to start with dill today because it's maybe my favorite herb to freeze dry, and it's the one I'm doing the most of. And when you're picking dill for the freeze dryer and just kind of for your everyday cooking, these green fronds are what you want. The yellow heads are pungent and a little bit different tasting than the green leaves. They're perfect for pickle making, but they're not what I want for freeze drying, so I'm going to leave these. And I'm harvesting a ton of dill today because I love it so much. My favorite uses for freeze-dried dill are in tuna salad, in homemade ranch dressing, and on baked salmon. Rosemary can grow pretty tough and woody, so unlike a lot of other herbs that are more tender and I could just kind of snap off with my fingers, I need a scissors to harvest this. I use freeze-dried rosemary in the winter for hearty meats, things like beef stew and pot roast, but I especially love it on citrus and rosemary mixed nuts. And thyme. Ideally, you want to harvest your herbs before they flower, but it's okay. For harvesting thyme for freeze drying, you want to pick the whole woody stem. And sometimes if it gets really woody, I will use the scissors to harvest these. As far as what I like to do with freeze-dried thyme, this is a soup herb for me. I put thyme in just about every soup or stew I make. On to the sage. This is another herb where the more you harvest it, the more you encourage it to grow. So I'm just going to kind of snap these off at their more tender tops, and then that way the plant will keep growing and I can still harvest plenty. And sage is another classic soup herb for me, but of course it also grows great on poultry and in your Thanksgiving stuffing. Are you even a gardener if you don't run your hands through your fresh herbs every time you walk by? That is one of my favorite things to do. This is parsley, and I would say it's probably my second favorite freeze-dried herb after dill, or at least my second most used herb anyways. And you know, both fresh and freeze-dried, parsley doesn't have a ton of flavor, especially compared to other herbs, but what it does have is a beautiful green color. So I end up adding it to a lot of dishes just for a pop of green, and I really appreciate that, especially in the middle of winter. If you've ever had regular dried basil, you know it falls so flat compared to fresh, but not freeze-dried. Freeze-dried basil is on a whole other level. It is incredibly delicious, and of course I use it on everything Italian. And you'll see here as I'm harvesting this, I am pulling big stems pretty far down in the plant, and that's going to encourage all these little clusters underneath to grow big and tall and grow lots more basil. Now that I have all my herbs picked, I'm going to get them in the house and get processing them right away. And a quick word about washing your herbs. I never do. Mine aren't dirty. They don't really have bugs, and I picked them with clean hands, so I don't wash them. But if you need to wash yours, go ahead and do that and just dry them before you get started on this. So for basil and other leafy herbs like basil, I like to pluck the leaf and leave the stems behind. I'm not super finicky about it. You don't have to be perfect, but in general, I like to try to avoid getting the stems with the leaves. So sometimes it's even helpful to use your fingernail, like I'm doing here, to pluck those leaves right off the stems. In general, for freeze-drying herbs, you want to leave things whole, so no chopping necessary. Leave them just as they are. Dill is a pretty easy one to process. Again, I want to avoid any thick stems just like this. I want just the more tender, dainty, leafy parts. And you can pretty much just break the tips of these right off. It's okay if you get some of the smaller, fatter stems, just not the fat stems, you know what I mean? So just break off those thinner pieces, and then when you get towards the top, or if you have some that are bigger and thicker, you can actually just strip them off like this. Sometimes when you're stripping them, you might accidentally break off more than you wanted to of the bigger pieces, and then you can just kind of tear them off the bottom so you're left with the nice thin parts. Rosemary is another easy one. I love working with rosemary. It leaves that sticky, good-smelling residue on your fingers. And all you have to do for rosemary is just slide it, strip it backwards down the stem, just like that. And that works well for most of the stem except for the tippy top. So when I get to up here, I just kind of pull the needles off and break the tip off. Parsley is almost identical to basil as far as how it's processed. So I'm going to go through and just pick off the top of the leaves here and leave any of the bigger stems behind. I try to avoid the stems just because once they're dry, they can get a little bit woody or hard or kind of pokey. So I like to not include those. Okay, next up is thyme, and thyme is a little bit of a special situation here. It's got tiny, tiny leaves that we do want to remove, but we're actually going to save that work until after it's freeze dried. We are going to freeze dry it just like this. And the best way to do that, I found, is to try to keep them all kind of straight and packed together and just pack them in on the trays as thickly as you can. The reason we're doing this one kind of backwards is because these leaves are so tiny and so light that they'll just fly all over the freeze dryer. So keeping them on the stem makes it a lot easier. Oh, I almost forgot sage. How can I forget sage? So of all of the leafy herbs that we're pulling from the stems like basil and parsley, it is most important to get the sage leaves from the stems and not include hardly any of the stem if you can help it. Sage just has the woodiest, pokiest stems more than any other herb I've worked with. So I try really hard to make sure that I'm plucking right at the base of that leaf. One thing that's really important when you freeze dry anything is to not overload the trays. Now that's not as important with herbs or not something you have to worry about as much just because they're very light to begin with and they don't have a ton of water in them. Another general rule of thumb for freeze drying is to not have the food come up past the sides of the pan. So you can see here I am trying to pack this in and kind of compact it and squish it down so I can make the most of my tray space. And with herbs, I found that you can cheat just a little bit. You can have them sticking up just a hair past the edge of the pan. This dill really packs in there pretty nicely, and I am going to do my best to really press it down so I can fit as much as possible on this pan. For sage, the easiest way that I found is to keep all the leaves facing the same way, lined up like little soldiers or little sardines, and pile them on the pan in rows just like this. The thyme we already talked about, we're going to leave that just as it is. Rosemary is a little haphazard, kind of like the dill. I just kind of pack it down every which way. And that packs pretty well in there. Basil and parsley do not pack well. The leaves are big and curly, and they kind of have like a fluffy quality that makes them stand up, so you can't press them down quite as much. So I just do my best and try to fit as much on the tray as I can without having it stick up too far. Before we stick these trays in the freezer and then the freeze dryer, we are going to add an insurance policy. Do you remember how I talked about how the thyme leaves can fly around in the freeze dryer? Well, the other herbs can do that too. They're light, it's under a vacuum in there, there's a lot of air pressure. So what I like to do is take just a piece of cheesecloth that I have cut to be about the size of these trays and drape it over the top. Doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be fancy. You do kind of have to stretch it out a little bit because it wants to curl back on itself. But I just lay it right across the herbs before I put them in the freezer. Now I always pre-freeze pretty much everything I freeze dry, and herbs are no exception, so I am throwing these into the freezer with the cheesecloth and all so it gets nice and cold. One important thing I do for herbs is I customize the temperature. I have my dry temperature default set to 125, which is a little higher than I want, so I'm going to turn it down to more like 100 for herbs, which is going to help retain all of their beautiful flavor and scent. And I'm not going to give you a specific time for how long to freeze dry these for because I think everyone's machine is different and everyone's herbs will be different. So listen to your machine. And another rule of thumb is to always add extra dry time. I let these go for about 24 hours, which was 8 hours of extra dry time above and beyond what the machine wanted to do, which is a pretty standard amount for me to use. And they're definitely wonderfully dry and ready. I really love having a freeze dryer. There are just so many unique and interesting things you can preserve with it, and the quality and the shelf life of freeze-dried foods is really excellent. And if you ever consider getting one, I have an affiliate link with Harvest Right freeze dryers, which I'll put in the video description below. I really, really appreciate it if you use my links whenever you can. It's a great way to support me here, and I'm really grateful. And of course, just like anything I freeze dry, I get these out of the machine and get them packaged up immediately. I don't wait. I get going right away on it. And the first step here is to remove the cheesecloth, which sometimes has a few little herbs sticking to it, but overall is not a pain in the butt or anything like that. And by the way, I reuse this cheesecloth over and over. You definitely don't need to cut new stuff every time. Once I'm done with it, I stuff it in a Ziploc bag and I keep it with my freeze drying supplies for when I need it. One thing I like to do when I take something out of the freeze dryer before I get too deep into packaging it up is to just run my hands through it. to make sure that everything feels really dry and really good. And you can hear how dry and lovely these are. And you can see it when I squish it, it just disintegrates. These are definitely looking great. And into the jars they go. Now there's kind of a Goldilocks point here. Let me show you something. If I were just to put these leaves into the jars whole, they would take up so much room and I would not be able to fit hardly any in a jar. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to mash them up. I'm going to crush them, but I don't want to crush them too much. I want to crush them just enough so that they fit a little bit better in the jar. And I think that they retain more flavor that way if you don't totally like powder them or pulverize them before you use them. And now as I'm putting these into the jar, I'm also going to kind of crush them into the jar. You can see I have some big pieces here. They're not like totally little flakes of basil. And if I want to make them littler, I can always crush them when I take them out of the jar. Like I can pinch them in my fingers right before I add them to whatever I'm cooking. But I think this Goldilocks approach works well. Crush them as much as you need to pack them into the jar, but don't over crush them. This basil is just so incredibly fragrant. I think you will be amazed at the flavor your freeze-dried herbs have. And then one last tip, don't waste any. Make sure every last crumb of herb makes it into a jar. And of course you want to get the lid on right away. I'm not using an oxygen absorber in these because I'm going to use these pretty soon. But if I were storing these long term, or if I were storing them even more than like 3-4 months, I'd probably put one in just to help them out a bit. All right, check out this dill, this mat of dill, which is, if you ask me, just gorgeous. The color that this retains is unlike anything you would get in a regular dehydrated dried herb. Dill's a pretty easy one to package up. I'm not going to pre-crush it like I did to the basil. I'm just going to crush it as I stuff it into the jar. And I can really pack quite a bit of dill in here. Similar to the basil, I don't want to crush this more than I need to. I'm just going to crush it enough so that it fits nicely in the jar. And while I'm stuffing this in here, let me talk about container size for a minute because I think that's an important consideration for freeze-dried herbs. I always use small containers. I never use anything bigger than these 8-ounce jelly jars, and I think that this is a nice size for herbs. Because these are dry and because it's something that you're going to be dipping into all the time, right? Like I might be opening this jar several times a week. I wouldn't want it in a big jar because by the time I got down to the bottom of that big jar, those herbs at the bottom would have suffered. They would have been exposed to oxygen a ton of times over a long time, where when I make smaller jars like this, by the time I get to the bottom, the herbs in it aren't that old. Does that make sense? So use small containers, and if you are packing these away for long-term storage, definitely consider Mylar bags instead of glass jars because they also protect against light. Now onto the parsley. Just like basil, this one is super simple and straightforward. I'm just going to pre-crush it a little bit so that it fits in the jar. And then I'm going to pack it into the jar and kind of crush it as I pack it in. This is probably a good time to point out one more tip, and that is whenever I can, I like to keep it to one type of herb per tray. I did a bunch here just because I was showing you a bunch of herbs today. You can see they get mixed together a little bit and they all drop little herb crumbs that get kind of mixed together and are hard to separate. Onto the rosemary, which is another really simple one. I don't really pre-crush my rosemary like I do with some of the other more leafier herbs. I like leaving this one whole. I like seeing the needle shape. I think it's really beautiful. And then of course, if I want it smaller, I can always just crush it up when I'm about to use it. You'll also notice that even though I am shoving it in the jar, it's not quite as breakable and as brittle as some of the other herbs. So even though I'm shoving it in there, it mostly is staying whole. Freeze-dried sage has the coolest texture and sound. Listen to this. I just love it. I want to like swim in a pool of freeze-dried sage. Anyways, just like the other leafies, I'm going to crush this one. I'm going to pre-crush it just so it starts to fit in the jar a little bit better. You know, before I had a freeze dryer, I did a lot of just regular drying and dehydrating of herbs, which is fine and wonderful and works well. But once you've had freeze-dried herbs, I feel like you can kind of never go back. They are so vibrant, and you can see here the color that these have. It's such a beautiful, vibrant color, and then they have the taste to go along with it. It's almost like, it really is like eating fresh herbs. Okay, I saved the thyme for last just because it's the most labor-intensive on this side of freeze drying. It's not hard by any means, but it's a little bit more work than just shoving it in a jar. We need to get these little leaves off the stems, which luckily come right off. They pretty much fall right off when you touch them. The stems are brittle, but they don't break really easily. The leaves, however, fall right off. So all you have to do, even though I'm kind of using a stripping motion here, just as soon as you touch them, they will crumble off. And you can do them one at a time, or you can do them in bunches. You do need just a little bit of a finesseful hand here. But you know, if you do get a few little stems in there, you can always just pick them right out. And that's it. That is freeze drying herbs. I use these pretty much the same way that I would use a regular dried herb. And I would also say that I use them in a few places where I wouldn't use a dried herb, but that I would use a fresh herb instead. These herbs really do feel just so full of life. I promise if you freeze dry these correctly, they will be the best dried herbs you will ever have. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and if you found this video helpful, I would love it if you could give it a thumbs up, and make sure to subscribe to my channel so that you are the first to know whenever a new video is posted.